Welcome everybody to the third topic in this particular module, Governing Forests as Commons. This particular topic is Design Principles and Forest Governance. In the first topic, we understood why forests are considered as commons. In the second part, we looked at institutions that are used to govern forests, and we found that a lot of empirical evidence shows us that when people themselves are a part of governance, they tend to govern the forest more sustainably. Now, this does not mean that at all points of time that if there is local participation, there is better sustainability of the forest. It just means that in certain cases, for centuries, people have come together in order to govern their landscapes, and it has led to the sustainable governance of that particular resource. In many cases, we find people haven't even come together. In certain cases, they've come together and dissipated. But in some cases, there are instances where for centuries, Adivasi groups have come together to govern the resource sustainably. A good example of this are the Todas of the Nilgiris, who have governed their pasture land for centuries. In Switzerland, where Ostrom does her fieldwork, her first field site, she looks at how farmers govern their grazing lands, which are held in common for centuries. They make their rules in the 1500s and continue to follow them even till today. It is these type of institutions that we are interested in. When we're saying that governance of resources like forests by the government or by private entities does not always work out very well and forests tend to degrade, our question then is that when we're saying that local communities have succeeded in governing their resource sustainably over centuries, what is it that characterizes these institutions? When can forests be governed sustainably by people themselves through common property regimes? Now, Ostrom looks at a number of such successful cases and comes out with something she calls as design principles. Now, what does she mean by design principles? She means a condition that helps to account for the success of these institutions in sustaining a forest or other common pool resources and gaining the compliance of generation after generation of users to the rules applied in a location. What does this mean? This basically means you look at successful common pool resource regimes, local governance regimes that have governed a forest for centuries, and look at what are those characteristics that make them successful. Now, she puts these together as a set of research designs or design principles, which we are going to basically look at. Now, the first principle that Ostrom gives is the design principle of clearly defined boundaries. What does she mean by this? By clearly defined boundaries, she's talking of two types of boundaries. One, it's the boundary for the resource itself, and two, it is in terms of the users. Let's take our pasture land, the example I gave you earlier. When we said this is a pasture land, I would mean that there is a boundary to it. We know that 100 households graze their 100 cattle on a particular piece of land that has a set boundary. If we take the example of forests, we're basically saying that this strand of particular forest is the strand that community A is dependent on. So if a particular person who's a forest resource dependent person is extracting non-timber forest produce, they know from where they're extracting it, and there's a boundary that is implicit, and this boundary is agreed upon by all the users. We also know who these users are. So when we're saying our pasture land, we know who those 100 households are. In terms of our non-timber forest produce extraction, we know who are the people that are going to extract that particular forest produce and come back. All right. So that's the first principle, clearly defined boundaries. The second principle that she says that you require for successful local governance, community governance of forests is congruence. What do you mean by congruence? Now, congruence also is at two levels. The first thing that she's talking about when she's talking about congruence is in terms of congruence of cost. All right. When you have a particular resource, it costs something in order to extract the resource, in order to maintain the resource, right? that cost should be shared among all the users. Now remember, only if I am able to identify that this is the resource and that these are the users can I then actually say that this cost is then shared by these particular users. What is the second level of congruence? The second level of congruence is in terms of benefit. Therefore, I'm saying that when a particular resource is used, the benefit should also be equally shared by all the people who are bearing the cost. For example, our pasture land. Our pasture land needs to be maintained. People from those 100 households should bear the cost of maintaining it either through labor or through money, and the benefit from it in terms of having grass to feed your cattle should also be equally shared among all people. Not only that, when she's talking about congruence of cost and benefit, she's also talking of congruence in terms of the local condition, meaning it can't be generalized, right? It depends on the location where the resource is. So that's what she means by congruence. So the second feature you require for successful local governance is congruence. The third thing that she was talking about is collective choice agreements. Now, what do we mean by collective choice agreements? In order to understand this third design principle, we have to understand another term that she has, which is called as operational rules. Say you have a strand of forest, a standing forest. From that particular standing forest, you have a resource-dependent community who go to this particular forest to get a non-timber forest produce. Now, when they are going and collecting it, these people who are dependent on that particular resource come up with rules in terms of how they use that resource. To simplify this example using our pasture land, say you have these 100 households. We decide together, all 100 sitting together, that 10 people will use this particular pasture land to graze between 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. The next 10 would graze between 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. We also decide on things like every household would have only one cow. See, these are the operational rules. How would I use the resource? In terms of our forests, what type of NTFPs can be collected? We will collect in this particular season honey. We will collect in the second season medicinal plants. You can collect, that means each household can collect only 1 kg of honey per day. These are the operational rules which will decide the timing of collection. What type of technology will be used? For example, honey, which is a very popular non-timber forest produce, can be collected in many ways. It can be collected by smoking the hive, but it can also be collected by using chemicals, right? Suppose the people come together and say, no, we are only going to smoke the hive. That ensures that the bees can come back to that particular hive. All of these are called operational rules. These operational rules are decided by whom? If you need successful local governance, according to Ostrom, these have to be decided collectively. And that's what she means by collective choice agreements. People who are dependent on that resource, who live in that particular location, come together and decide how they're going to use that particular resource. So that's the third. So the first, clearly defined boundaries. The second, congruence of cost and benefit. And the third, in terms of collective choice agreements, deciding the rules together. What's the fourth one? Now you have rules, right? The fourth is monitoring. Suppose you have a rule. Say the pasture land rule, I said that from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m., these 10 households will use that particular pasture land. We want to know whether only those 10 households are using it. There should be a means by which monitoring can take place. In terms of our forests, if we're saying that in this particular season, only honey can be collected and only this much honey can be collected per household, there should be a way in which monitoring takes place. Now, this monitoring does not mean creating a second tier above the people, but rather the people themselves monitoring each other. A very common practice in India is wherein which households have this long stick, wherein which this stick will define who will monitor the extraction from a particular resource, and this stick is passed on from household to household. So at different points of time, different households act as monitors for that particular resource. So By monitoring, Ostrom means actively auditing the common pool resource condition as well as the user's behavior. You're seeing which user uses how much. So that's the fourth one. What's the fifth principle? The fifth principle she talks of is graduating sanctions. You have the rules, you have the monitoring. What happens if somebody breaks the rules? If a rule is to actually exist, then if a person breaks the rules, they need to be punished. And that's what graduating sanctions means. Users who violate the operational rules are likely to receive a particular sanction. It could be a fine, it could be that you would sell your produce and share the profit with everyone. It could mean that you're banned from using that particular resource for a particular period of time. But what does she then mean by graduating sanctions? She basically says there cannot be just one sanction. Say you're a first-time violator, you pay a fine. Suppose you violate the operational rules the second time. This time you are banned. Suppose you violate it the third time, then you will be taken to the beat officer, the forest officer. This is what we mean by graduating sanctions. It doesn't mean that the first time you violate, you automatically are punished at the highest level. Then nobody would actually participate, right? But instead it means that at different levels of violation, you have different sanctions. This is to ensure accountability of the users to the rules. Her sixth design principle in terms of forest governance is conflict resolution mechanism. Now, in all times, we really don't need sanctions. Say, for example, in our pasture land, we have timings in terms of who grazes at what time. A particular person whose timings from 9 to 10 goes and finds that a person whose timing is from 10 to 11 has come. And there's a conflict between them. We shouldn't go to sanctions straight away. What is required is that this particular conflict should be mediated. And at what level should it be mediated? It should be mediated at the level of the resource users themselves. Ostrom says that users and their officials have rapid access to low-cost, local arena resolution of the conflict. Meaning that if there is a conflict in terms of the use of the resource, in terms of the rule, in terms of the monitoring, in terms of who sets the rules, there should be a mechanism within the people themselves to come together and resolve that particular issue at that scale. And it has to be low cost, meaning it should be at the most minimum cost. Her final design principle, her seventh one, is minimal recognition of rights to organize. She says minimal because she's hoping that at least this much is possible. What does she mean? She basically states that no institution exists in isolation. Whether you have a community forest or an Adivasi group that have been monitoring and regulating and governing their resource for centuries, they operate within broader set structures, right? The structure of government, the structure of market. When Ostrom was talking about her seventh principle, she was basically saying that the rights of users to derive or devise their own institutions should not be challenged by external government authorities. Say you have the Forest Act or you have the Biodiversity Act. These acts should provide space within them to allow communities to govern themselves. It should provide the recognition that people have the right to collectively govern the resource. And this is what she means by minimal recognition to organize. Now, if this was any other common pool resource, we would stop with these 7 design principles. However, given that we're talking of forests as commons, there is one more design principle that needs to be added that Ostrom herself adds, which is called as nested enterprise. Remember, I told you that 82% of the forests are governed by governments. This means that governments are involved greatly in the governance of this structure. So you have government on top, and recognition for communities is given within these government structures. That's one form of nestedness. The second form of nestedness is wherein which the benefits you get from forest, right? So why do local communities want to govern that resource sustainably? Because they want the non-timber forest produce for their livelihood. But what about at a different level? What about the benefits we receive in terms of climate change, of biodiversity? So we're talking about benefits also operating at different levels. Hence, when we're talking about design principles, Ostrom states that common pool resources that are part of a larger system, in this case, appropriation, provision, monitoring, enforcement, conflict resolution, all of the things that we talked of earlier, and government activities are organized in multiple layers of nested enterprises. Let me give you an example of nested enterprises in terms of forests. Say you have an Adivasi group that have organized together in order to govern collectively a particular strand of forests. Now they need recognition for this governance structure by the forest officials. If not, they're not going to be allowed to operate. Now when would the forest officials, say the beat officer or the circle officer or the district forest officer, the DFO, actually give this recognition? They would give it only if the laws themselves give this particular space to local communities to organize. And this is what we mean by nestedness. Benefits are nested, governance structures have to be nested, monitoring has to be nested, and conflict resolution also has to be nested. Hence, Ostrom gives us 8 design principles for governance of forests as commons. 1. Clearly defined boundaries. 2. Congruence, cost and benefit. 3. Collective choice arrangements. 4. Monitoring. 5. Graduated sanctions. 6. Conflict resolution mechanisms. 7. Minimal recognition of rights to organize. And 8. Mainly in terms of forests, nested enterprises. Many sites around the world wherein which governance of forests across 3 institutions, government, private and local regimes, have been compared, and it has been found that in terms of outputs like conservation, sustainability, improvement in forest condition, local governance regimes that follow Ostrom's design principles do comparatively better on the long run when compared to government or private. Common property regimes also addresses the needs of millions of people who are dependent on forests for their livelihoods, as it gives control of the forest in their hands. When they govern the forest themselves, they are incentivized to actually govern its sustainability over a long period of time. The core of common property regimes that operate on the design principles therefore lies in decentralization of power, giving power to govern the resources to the people themselves. This brings us to the end of the third topic. At this point of time, I would like to summarize the points that have been mentioned over the last 2 topics as well as this one. We looked at forests as commons, we looked at governance of forests as commons, and then we looked at design principles. We have understood that we cannot generalize the idea that only external authorities who impose rules from above can ensure sustainability of the forests. Common property regimes have been found to be quite apt at providing sustainable forest governance that caters to the needs of millions of resource-dependent communities. For common property regimes to be successful, there has to be participation, there has to be control in terms of who makes the rules, and most importantly, there has to be community and trust. I would like to repeat. And most importantly, there has to be communication and trust. This basically means that when people don't talk to each other, when they can't talk to each other, it's very hard for common property regimes to exist or local governance to exist. Communication becomes key to ensuring that the design principles exist and that local governance operate effectively. If users can engage in face-to-face bargaining and have autonomy to change their rules, they may well attempt to organize themselves, and by organizing themselves, achieve benefits for themselves as well as for the resource. Whether their self-government enterprise or self-organizing enterprise or institution succeeds over the long term depends on whether the institutions they develop are consistent with the design principles underlying robust, long-living self-governance systems. Thank you.